Now we're ready to talk about three of the main policy tools the Federal Reserve uses to manage the money supply. We've seen that changes in deposits affects the money supply. And so now we're going to see how the Federal Reserve can use that to purposely increase or decrease the money supply. And ultimately, the point is to have an impact on the overall macro economy, which is what we will see when we bring in the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. So what we're talking about is monetary policy, and we do talk about them growing or decreasing the money supply. The object is to affect the interest rates, and we'll see that in a later video. But the reason they want to affect the interest rates is that affects the consumption and saving decisions of the households, and it affects the borrowing decisions of the firms. So we're talking about affecting consumption, we're talking about affecting investment, two of the components of aggregate demand. And then that will obviously allow them to have some impact in the short run on the macro economy. So, three tools that we're going to look at are open market operations, discount policy, and reserve requirements. The one we're familiar with at this point should be the reserve requirements, because that's going to involve the required reserve ratio. But we're going to start with the favorite tool of the Federal Reserve because it's a little more refined. Their ability to achieve their target is a little better, and that is the open market operations. There's a committee in the Federal Reserve called the Federal Open Market Committee, and you'll see this FOMC abbreviation, and they're the ones that come together to decide the open market operations. Essentially, they make decisions like, do we want to increase macroeconomic activity? Do we want to decrease it? Do we want to hold things the same? And ultimately, what open market operations is about is the buying and selling of Treasury securities. So what we have to realize, first of all, is the Federal Reserve has a portfolio of assets. They're already in existence. They own, obviously, some U.S. money, and that money that they have is not considered part of the money supply. That's outside the system. They own foreign currency. They own foreign assets, foreign bonds, probably of other governments. And they own government bonds from our government. Now, just to make this clear, when our government, the Congress and President, spend more than they have taken in tax revenue, they have to borrow it. They don't literally print it. They actually have to put out a Treasury bond, and it's an IOU. And they sell the bond. They don't care who buys it. They get the money. The government gets the money, and then they use it to spend it. And then at some point, according to the terms of the bond, they have to pay it back with interest. All right, so the Federal Reserve is not involved in issuing those bonds, buying those bonds, nothing. Those bonds are supposed to be issued by the U.S. government and bought by what we can call the public. The public buys these bonds, and then you have a secondary market. All right, so you have the initial issuance, does not involve the Federal Reserve. But once these bonds are out there in the real world, they can be bought and sold by anyone. So what I'm describing is the U.S. Treasury, which is our government, is issuing Treasury bills and bonds as they need to cover the extra spending they're doing. The public buys. The public is us, it's individuals, it's institutions, it's pension funds, it could even be foreigners, but we're mainly going to think about it just being us buying it. So we buy it, and now we are holding pieces of paper. Here's your FOMC, part of the Federal Reserve. They also own, from previous times, some of these bonds that they have bought from the public. So they have the option now to buy or sell bonds, and that is open market operations, all right? So if they want to sell bonds to the public, they take pieces of paper out of their already existing portfolio, hand it to the public, all right? So think about what that means. The public then is going to have to grab money from the banking system and give it to the Federal Reserve. So what they have done when they do that is pulled money out of a bank, which is part of the money supply, given it to the Fed, and the Fed has removed that money from the money supply, right? Because like I said, the money the Fed holds is not part of the money supply. So when the FOMC gives the order to sell bonds, they're essentially pulling money out of the banking system and decreasing the money supply. So you're going to want to think about that a little bit. And it doesn't hurt to have to think through the steps each time. But basically what we're seeing is that when the Fed gives the order to sell bonds, the impact is to decrease the money supply. All right, just to be clear, if the Fed, FOMC gives the order to buy bonds, then what the Federal Open Market Committee is doing is actually buying bonds from the public. So now they're taking pieces of paper out of the hands of the public, and that goes to the Fed. And then the Federal Open Market Committee is handing money to the public. Money that has not previously been in the banking system is now going into their hands where they will deposit it. And then we know the simple deposit multiplier shows how much the money supply could potentially grow. And that, in a nutshell, is the open market operation. So the Federal Reserve is, particularly the FOMC, is meeting regularly every quarter, and they're deciding, should we give an order to buy or sell bonds in order to target a particular interest rate so that that will have an impact on the macroeconomy. That's where we're going to be taking it. But for right now, you just want to understand which action causes an increase in the money supply, buying bonds, which action causes the money supply to decrease, giving the order to sell bonds. The second tool is discount policy. The Federal Reserve has, as part of its toolbox, the discount loans. And that is when the Federal Reserve makes a loan to the bank. And if you're going to make a loan, you're going to charge an interest rate. And the specific name of that interest rate is the discount rate. Don't know why, doesn't seem like the best name for something, but there you go. It's called the discount rate. And so therefore, this is a discount policy. So the discount rate is the rate the Fed is charging on the discount loans that the Fed makes to the banks. And so the tool that we're talking about is just the Federal Reserve making changes to the discount rate. So in general, again, what we're trying to think about is how to affect the money supply. So if we want to increase the money supply, we need to get more money in the hands of the banks. If we want to get more money in the hands of the banks, using this tool, the Fed would lower the interest rate. They would lower the interest rate, not just the interest rate, but the discount rate, right? They would lower the interest rate and, I keep saying lower the discount rate. And when you make an interest rate lower, people will borrow more, just in general. So a lower discount rate would theoretically increase discount loans, okay? And if the banks are making more discount loans, they're having more money in their hands, maybe they're making loans with it to the public, it's increasing their reserves, so that's going to ultimately lead to a lower federal funds rate when we get to discussing that. But I would have to say that this is not the most refined tool for the banks, for the Fed. The Fed can't make a bank take a loan. It's just a influential possibility that if they lower the discount rate, that this could grow the money supply. So it is a potential tool. It's one the Fed tends to use more for bank stability than monetary policy. That is, if there's something that happens that's scary to the banking system that might cause us to all run to the bank and grab our money out, the Fed will tend to use this tool to just flood the reserves the banks are holding, so that banks feel comfortable holding a lot of extra reserves. It's not going to cost them a lot to hold a whole bunch of reserves. And once we're all aware that there's a ton of reserves out there, then our need to go run on the bank is down. So back when we had 9/11 happen, that was one time the Fed used this tool in that way. So we're learning it right now as 3 potential tools for monetary policy. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Its main use is for stability, but if you were going to use it for monetary policy, this is the theory. You decrease the discount rate, you decrease the cost of the loan, the banks will take more discount loans, and therefore the money supply will grow. And our third tool is the one we're most familiar with, the reserve requirements, which involves the Fed setting the required reserve ratio. You may have already thought about this a little bit when we were looking at the calculation of using the simple deposit multiplier. So we saw that if you had a $1,000 deposit and you had a 10% required reserve ratio, that potentially could grow the deposits by 10,000. If you decide to decrease the required reserve ratio from 10% to 5%, then that is going to lead to a higher calculated amount of 20,000. So what we can see here, just doing the calculation itself, you don't even have to memorize it. You can just do the calculation and prove it to yourself as you need to. Lowering the required reserve ratio, so going from 10% to 5%, leads to a higher potential impact on the money supply. So decreasing the required reserve ratio could increase the money supply. All right, so to increase the money supply, we can use these three tools specifically by using open market operations. You give the order to buy bonds. I buy bonds, I buy bonds. Remember, when I say I'm the Federal Reserve, the FOMC. So I am buying bonds, I am taking pieces of paper, and I, the Fed, am having to take money out of our non-money supply account, give it to the public's going to put it into the banks, and the money supply will grow. The second tool is decreasing the discount rate. By decreasing the discount rate, potentially banks will borrow more, they will have more reserves on hand, and the money supply can grow. And the third tool is decreasing the required reserve ratio, essentially telling banks that for every deposit made, you have to hold less of it, allows them to have more to loan out, and the money supply can grow. So having gone through all three tools, yes, of course, you need to understand the direction you would use these tools to increase the money supply or decrease it. I just want to point out one last thing, which is that while the Federal Reserve can use these three tools to have substantial influence over the money supply, its influence is not absolute. There are still players in here they cannot control. The firms and the households still have to be willing to take the loans, right? Just because you've made it so there's more reserves and the banks want to make more loans doesn't mean that you can make the households and firms take on the extra loans. And another possibility is the Federal Reserve uses these tools and they increase the reserves and the banks can make more loans. But what if the banks don't want to? What if they're not comfortable with the economic situation? What if they think there's potential problem with the value of their assets? Like a lot of loans are backed up by real estate. You've had a housing crisis perhaps recently, and the value of your loans may not actually be what you think they are if people are going to not be paying them back, right? So there's all sorts of things like that that can be going on that is outside the control of the Federal Reserve. So they do have some other, well, I should say they did create some other tools after our last financial crisis in 2009 because the Federal Reserve was dealing with some unique new situations. So they created some new tools. But for now, your purposes, just learn these three tools and have some understanding of how the Federal Reserve's actions can at least lead in the direction of increasing or decreasing the money supply. And then from here, we want to see how that affects interest rates and then how that affects our overall macroeconomy with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model.